The summer heat of Mississippi pressed against the barracks windows of Camp McCain like an unwelcome visitor, but inside the cramped interrogation room, the air felt even more stifling. Lieutenant Wilhelm Brenner shifted uncomfortably in his wooden chair, the fabric of his faded prisoner uniform clinging to his back with perspiration. His steel-gray eyes, which had once scanned battlefields across Normandy with calculated precision, now focused intently on the peculiar American contraption sitting before him on the scratched wooden table. The machine was unlike anything he had encountered during his years as a panzer commander. Black metal housing gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, and dozens of small circular keys were arranged in neat rows across its face. Each key bore a single letter or symbol, their white faces stark against the dark mechanism. Brenner's calloused fingers, scarred from years of operating tank controls and handling ammunition, traced the smooth surface of the keys with genuine curiosity. Behind the one-way mirror that dominated the far wall, Captain James Morrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and made careful notations in his leather-bound journal. His brown eyes never left the group of German prisoners as they examined what he knew they would consider primitive American technology. Morrison had been studying prisoner psychology for months, and he understood that patience would be his greatest weapon in this particular battle of wits. In the corner of the room, Sergeant Hans Meller leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face creased with skepticism. Muller had survived 3 brutal winters on the Eastern Front, had witnessed the mechanized efficiency of German engineering firsthand, and now found himself staring at what appeared to be nothing more than an elaborate American puzzle. His thick fingers, still bearing the calluses from operating MG-42 machine guns, pressed down experimentally on several keys in succession. Nothing happened. The paper remained blank, pristine white against the black rubber roller that held it in place. Muller's eyebrows furrowed as he tried again, this time pressing harder, expecting some miraculous transformation that never came. The keys depressed with satisfying clicks, but no marks appeared on the waiting paper. "Look at this American foolishness," Muller whispered to Private Klaus Richter, who sat hunched over an identical machine at the adjacent table. His voice carried the weary amusement of a soldier who had seen too much of war's absurdities to be surprised by anything. "They expect us to write our confessions on machines that don't even work properly." Richter, barely 19 and captured during his first week in combat, nodded eagerly at the sergeant's words. His boyish face, still bearing the ghost of childhood freckles despite months of imprisonment, lit up with nervous laughter. The young soldier's hands trembled slightly as he mimicked Muller's actions, pressing keys with the desperate hope that somehow his machine might prove different, might reveal some hidden secret that the others had missed. Around the room, similar scenes played out at each of the 6 interrogation tables. Former Luftwaffe pilots who had navigated sophisticated Messerschmitt fighters through Allied flak fields now sat puzzled by simple office equipment. Tank crews who had maintained and operated the complex mechanical systems of Tiger tanks found themselves baffled by devices that American secretaries used every day. Lieutenant Brenner straightened in his chair, his military bearing asserting itself despite the circumstances. His sharp features, marked by a thin scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, hardened with growing frustration. He had commanded a company of Germany's finest armored vehicles, had coordinated complex battlefield maneuvers under enemy fire, yet this simple American machine defied his understanding. "Perhaps," Brenner said, his cultured accent cutting through the room's heavy atmosphere, "our captors believe we are children who can be entertained by broken toys." His words carried the authority of an officer accustomed to being obeyed, though now his only audience consisted of fellow prisoners sharing his confusion. Captain Morrison observed this exchange from his hidden position, noting how quickly the Germans had formed their hierarchy even in captivity. Brenner clearly commanded respect despite their circumstances, while Mueller served as the experienced non-commissioned voice of practical wisdom. The younger prisoners looked to both men for guidance, their uncertainty evident in every gesture and glance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the prisoners' faces as they continued their futile attempts to operate the typewriters. Each man approached the challenge differently. Some pressed keys frantically, others examined the mechanical components with methodical German precision, while a few simply sat back and observed their comrades' failures with growing amusement. Private Richter discovered that lifting the paper revealed a complex array of metal arms and springs beneath, but this revelation only deepened the mystery. "There are so many moving parts," he murmured to Muller, his voice filled with wonder. "Surely, something this complicated should produce results." Muller grunted his agreement, his experienced eyes scanning the mechanism with the same intensity he had once reserved for checking weapon systems. "German engineering would never create something so unnecessarily complex," he declared, though his tone carried a hint of grudging respect for the machine's intricate construction. The minutes stretched into an hour, then longer, as the prisoners struggled with their assigned task. Captain Morrison continued his observations, occasionally making notes about individual reactions or group dynamics. He had anticipated this phase of confusion and mockery. It was essential to his larger plan. As the afternoon sun shifted position outside the barred windows, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the interrogation room, the Germans' initial curiosity began transforming into something approaching contempt. They had been promised an opportunity to share their stories, to explain their actions during the war, yet their captors had provided them with malfunctioning equipment that seemed designed more for humiliation than communication. Sergeant Muller finally pushed back from his table with obvious disgust, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. The sound echoed through the room like a declaration of defeat, causing the other prisoners to look up from their own fruitless efforts. His weathered face bore the expression of a man who had endured enough foolishness for one day. "Even our children's toys work better than this American junk," he announced, his voice carrying across the room with unmistakable finality. Captain Morrison's boots echoed against the concrete floor of the observation room as he paced back and forth, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. Through the one-way mirror, he watched the German prisoners hunched over their typewriters, their fingers moving across the keys with the mechanical precision of men who had grown accustomed to their daily routine. What they didn't know was that every keystroke was part of an elaborate deception that had taken months to orchestrate. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen stood beside a metal table covered with glass vials, chemical compounds, and testing equipment. The Chinese-American specialist from the Army's Chemical Warfare Service adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and carefully measured a clear liquid into a small beaker. His movements were deliberate and practiced, the result of countless hours spent in secret laboratories across America, perfecting a formula that would change the course of their intelligence operations. "Are you certain the mixture is stable, Sergeant?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper as he continued to watch the prisoners through the glass. Chen nodded without looking up from his work. "Yes, sir. The invisible ink formula has been tested extensively. It dries completely clear and odorless, leaving no trace on the paper. Only when exposed to our specific chemical treatment will the text become visible." He paused, rolling up his sleeves to reveal skin that bore the faint stains of previous experiments. "I've spent months perfecting this, Captain. My hands still bear the marks of the failed attempts, and I've lost count of how many nights I went home with burning eyes from chemical fumes." The dedication in Chen's voice was unmistakable, and Morrison felt a surge of respect for the young sergeant who had volunteered for what many considered a fool's errand. The typewriters in the prisoner barracks weren't broken, as the Germans believed. Each machine had been carefully modified to work with Chen's revolutionary invisible ink, allowing the prisoners to unknowingly document their secrets while believing they were simply passing time with meaningless activities. In the prisoner barracks below, Lieutenant Klaus Brenner sat at his usual typewriter, his fingers hovering over the keys as he stared at the blank sheet of paper. Something had been bothering him about these sessions, though he couldn't quite articulate what it was. The American guards seemed almost too relaxed about allowing the prisoners such free access to the machines. There was something in their demeanor, a quiet confidence that suggested they knew something the prisoners didn't. Brenner glanced around the room at his fellow prisoners, most of whom were typing away with the same mindless dedication they had shown for weeks. Hans Meller, a young Wehrmacht soldier, was pecking at his keys with 2 fingers, muttering under his breath about the futility of the exercise. Across the room, Dr. Friedrich Hoffmann, the captured German scientist who had worked on V-2 rockets, sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap as he observed the scene with the analytical mind that had made him invaluable to the German war effort. "This is pointless," Muller complained, loud enough for the American guards to hear. "These machines produce nothing but blank pages. What sort of interrogation technique is this?" The guard nearest to him, a young private with freckles and red hair, simply shrugged. "Orders are orders. You boys just keep typing away." But Brenner noticed something in the guard's eyes, a flicker of amusement that seemed out of place given the mundane nature of the task. Dr. Hoffmann had noticed it too. The scientist's keen intellect, honed by years of complex calculations and problem-solving, had picked up on inconsistencies that his military counterparts had missed entirely. While the guards maintained their casual demeanor, the intelligence officers who occasionally visited the barracks watched the typing sessions with an intensity that suggested hidden purpose. Their eyes tracked every movement, every keystroke, with the focus of men who were witnessing something far more significant than blank pages being produced. "Lieutenant Brenner," Hoffmann said quietly, moving his chair closer to where Brenner sat. "Have you noticed anything unusual about our American hosts?" Brenner's hands stilled on the keyboard. The older scientist's question confirmed his own growing suspicions. "What do you mean, Doctor?" "Observe their behavior carefully," Hoffmann whispered, his voice barely audible above the clacking of typewriter keys. "The guards appear relaxed, almost bored. But watch the officers when they visit. They study us with the intensity of men who are collecting valuable intelligence, not overseeing a meaningless exercise." The realization hit Brenner like a physical blow. His training with the German High Command had prepared him to resist interrogation through mockery and false cooperation, but it had also taught him to recognize when he was being deceived. The Americans' quiet confidence, their willingness to allow the prisoners such apparent freedom, suddenly took on a sinister significance. "You think they're getting information from us somehow?" Brenner asked, his voice tight with concern. Hoffmann nodded slowly. "I believe these typewriters are not as broken as they appear. There must be some mechanism by which our keystrokes are being recorded, or our thoughts are being captured in ways we cannot see." Brenner felt a chill run down his spine as he considered the implications. For weeks, he and his fellow prisoners had been typing freely, documenting technical details about German military operations, troop movements, and weapon systems, all under the assumption that their words were disappearing into blank paper. If Hoffmann was right, they had been unwittingly providing their captors with a treasure trove of classified information. Back in the observation room, Captain Morrison watched as Brenner and Hoffmann engaged in their whispered conversation. He couldn't hear their words, but their body language suggested they were beginning to suspect something was amiss. "Sergeant Chen," Morrison said, "I think we may need to accelerate our timeline. Some of the prisoners are starting to ask questions." Chen looked up from his chemical preparations. "The invisible ink requires at least 12 hours to fully set before we can safely apply the revealing agent. If we rush the process, we risk losing everything we've collected." Morrison weighed the options carefully. They had already gathered weeks of intelligence from the prisoners, information that would prove invaluable to the war effort. But if the prisoners became suspicious and stopped typing, they would lose the opportunity to collect even more crucial data. Meanwhile, Brenner made a decision that would prove pivotal to everything that followed. Despite his growing suspicions, he began to type again, but this time with calculated precision. If the Americans were somehow capturing their keystrokes, he would give them information. but it would be carefully crafted disinformation designed to mislead rather than inform. His fingers moved across the keys with renewed purpose as he typed details about fictional German weapons programs, imaginary troop movements, and fabricated strategic plans. If his captors thought they were clever, he would show them that German intelligence training was superior to American deception. But as Brenner typed his false information, he failed to notice Dr. Hoffman's growing agitation. The scientist had spent the last several minutes studying the typewriter mechanism with the methodical approach that had made him one of Germany's leading rocket scientists. What he discovered made his blood run cold. The paper wasn't blank at all. Under close examination, he could see the faintest impressions where the typewriter keys had struck, suggesting that some form of invisible medium was recording every keystroke. The Americans hadn't just outsmarted them with a simple recording device. They had developed a sophisticated chemical system that allowed them to capture intelligence while maintaining the illusion of failure. "Brenner," Hoffman whispered urgently, "we must warn the others immediately. These machines are recording everything we type, but not in the way we initially suspected." Brenner's hands froze above the keyboard as the full scope of their situation became clear. The Americans had been playing a game of chess while the Germans thought they were playing checkers. Every confession, every technical detail, every strategic insight they had typed over the past weeks had been carefully preserved in invisible ink, waiting to be revealed when their captors chose to develop the pages. The weight of their collective betrayal settled over Brenner like a suffocating blanket. They had been so confident in their own superiority, so certain that their American captors were simple-minded soldiers, that they had walked directly into an elaborate trap. Now, as he looked around the room at his fellow prisoners, still typing away in blissful ignorance, he realized that their situation was far more dire than any of them had imagined. Dr. Hoffman leaned back in his chair, his scientific mind racing through the implications of what they had discovered. The invisible ink technology suggested a level of chemical sophistication that he had not expected from American intelligence services. Whoever had developed this system possessed a deep understanding of both chemistry and psychology, creating a perfect storm of technological innovation and human manipulation. As the afternoon sun streamed through the barred windows of the prisoner barracks, casting long shadows across the rows of typewriters, Hoffman spoke the words that would haunt both men for the remainder of their captivity. His voice carried the weight of newfound respect mixed with genuine fear as he acknowledged the scope of their miscalculation. Perhaps these Americans are not as simple as we believed them to be. The converted laboratory tent stood like a ghostly sentinel behind the camp's medical facility, its canvas walls rippling gently in the pre-dawn breeze that swept across the Mississippi landscape. Inside, the air hung thick with the acrid smell of developing chemicals and the weight of months of careful preparation. Sergeant Chen moved with practiced precision between the makeshift workstations, his fingers dancing across glass containers and temperature gauges with the muscle memory of a man who had learned his craft in a different world, in a different time. The amber glow of the safety lights cast long shadows across his weathered face as he checked the thermometer for the 100th time that night. 98 degrees Fahrenheit, exactly where it needed to be. His father's voice echoed in his memory, speaking in the gentle Cantonese of their San Francisco photography studio. "Temperature is everything, my son. Too hot, and you destroy the image. Too cold, and nothing emerges." Those words, spoken over trays of photographic developer in peaceful times, had taken on a meaning his father could never have imagined. Chen's hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from exhaustion. He had been working for 14 hours straight, preparing the chemical solutions that would reveal secrets hidden in plain sight. The invisible ink formulas had been perfected through weeks of trial and error, each batch refined until the revelation process could expose even the faintest traces of writing that had been carefully applied with seemingly innocent materials, lemon juice, milk, or the specialized compounds that German intelligence officers had somehow smuggled into the prisoner of war camp. As the first pale fingers of dawn crept through the tent's entrance flap, Footsteps approached on the gravel path outside. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hayes ducked through the canvas opening, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that spoke of military discipline and countless sleepless nights. Her eyes, sharp as a hawk's, immediately assessed the rows of prepared solutions and the stacks of seemingly blank letters that awaited revelation. "Is everything ready, Sergeant?" Hayes asked, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent years making decisions that could alter the course of history. "Yes, ma'am," Chen replied, wiping his hands on a chemical-stained towel. "The first batch is at optimal temperature. We should begin the process immediately while conditions are stable." Hayes nodded and moved to the first workstation, where dozens of letters lay arranged in precise rows. To any casual observer, these papers appeared completely innocuous. Personal correspondence from German prisoners to their families back home, already censored and approved for mailing by camp authorities. But Hayes knew better. These letters represented months of patient intelligence gathering, a sophisticated trap that had been laid with the precision of a master chess player thinking dozens of moves ahead. "Begin with Dr. Hoffman's correspondence," Hayes instructed, pointing to a specific stack of letters. "His engineering background makes his intelligence particularly valuable." Chen carefully lifted the first letter with tweezers, holding it at the edges to avoid contaminating the paper. The sheet looked utterly blank except for the visible writing in German that camp censors had already approved. With steady hands, he lowered the paper into the first chemical bath, watching as the solution began its mysterious work. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, like ghosts materializing from the morning mist, faint lines began to appear across the paper. Chen's breath caught in his throat as technical diagrams emerged, detailed sketches of rocket components, propulsion systems, and guidance mechanisms that Dr. Hoffman had unconsciously drawn while discussing what he believed were harmless engineering concepts with his American interrogators. "Remarkable," Hayes whispered, leaning closer to examine the revelations. "Look at this detail. He's provided specifications that our own engineers have been struggling to understand for months." As they worked through letter after letter, a comprehensive picture began to emerge. Lieutenant Brenner's casual conversations about tank maintenance had unknowingly yielded detailed intelligence about German armor vulnerabilities, supply chain weaknesses, and maintenance schedules. His invisible writings contained technical specifications, deployment patterns, and even personal observations about morale among German tank crews that would prove invaluable to Allied forces preparing for the next major offensive. The irony was almost overwhelming. In Berlin, German intelligence officers continued to receive these very letters, examining them carefully for any signs of hidden messages or coded information. Finding nothing suspicious, they forwarded the apparently innocent correspondence to families across the Reich, never suspecting that American scientists had already read every secret word before the letters ever left the prisoner of war camp. Hayes moved to another workstation where Sergeant Muller's letters awaited revelation. As the chemicals worked their magic, Muller's arrogant dismissal of American incompetence materialized on paper, along with crucial intelligence about German troop strength, morale assessments, and strategic concerns that he had foolishly committed to invisible ink, believing his captors too primitive to detect such sophisticated communication methods. "The enemy's greatest weakness," Hayes murmured, reading through page after page of materialized secrets, "has always been their inability to imagine that others might be smarter than themselves." Chen continued the painstaking process as morning light grew stronger outside the tent. Each letter revealed new layers of intelligence: submarine tactics that could save Allied shipping, troop movements across 3 theaters of war, and technical innovations that German engineers believed were safely hidden from American eyes. The prisoners had been writing their secrets in plain sight for months, their cultural arrogance blinding them to the sophisticated counterintelligence operation that had ensnared them completely. By mid-morning, Hayes stood surrounded by hundreds of pages of revealed intelligence, each document representing a piece of a vast puzzle that could potentially alter the course of the war. The scope of information was staggering. Everything from detailed technical specifications to personal assessments of German leadership, from supply shortages to strategic vulnerabilities that Allied commanders had only suspected. "Sergeant," Hayes said, her voice heavy with the weight of realization, "prepare a priority transmission to Washington. Based on what we've uncovered here, we may have gathered enough intelligence to shorten this war by months." Chen nodded, understanding the magnitude of what they had accomplished. The converted laboratory tent, with its improvised equipment and chemical baths, had become the unlikely birthplace of what might prove to be one of the most successful intelligence operations of the entire conflict. The invisible ink had revealed far more than hidden words. It had exposed the fundamental weakness of an enemy who believed their own propaganda about American inferiority. As Hayes carefully organized the revealed documents for transmission to higher command, she reflected on the months of patient preparation that had led to this moment. The careful psychological manipulation of the prisoners, the subtle encouragement of their letter writing, the deliberate cultivation of their contempt for American intelligence, all of it had been building toward this revelation. The morning sun climbed higher over the Mississippi landscape, its light streaming through the tent walls and illuminating the fruits of their nocturnal labor. In those pages of materialized text lay the power to save countless Allied lives and bring the war to a swifter conclusion. Hayes picked up the final batch of revealed letters, her eyes scanning the wealth of intelligence that German arrogance had delivered directly into American hands. The enemy's greatest weakness has always been their inability to imagine that others might be smarter than themselves. The morning frost clung to the windows of Captain Morrison's office like silver cobwebs, casting ethereal patterns across the wooden floor as Lieutenant Brenner stepped through the doorway. The December air bit at his exposed skin, but the chill that ran down his spine had nothing to do with the weather. Morrison sat behind his mahogany desk, his weathered face bearing an expression that Brenner had never seen before, a mixture of satisfaction and something darker, more calculating. "Take a seat, Lieutenant," Morrison said, his voice carrying an unusual weight that made Brenner's stomach clench with unease. As Brenner lowered himself into the rigid wooden chair across from the captain, Morrison began spreading papers across the desk's surface with deliberate precision. The documents cascaded like fallen leaves, dozens of pages covered in handwriting that Brenner recognized with growing horror as his own. His eyes darted across the familiar loops and curves of his penmanship, words and sentences that seemed to emerge from a forgotten dream. "Do you recognize this handwriting, Lieutenant?" Morrison asked, his fingers drumming against the desk with rhythmic intensity. Brenner's throat constricted as he leaned forward, his eyes scanning page after page of technical specifications, troop movements, and classified information, all written in his own careful script. The papers felt like accusations staring back at him, each line a testament to secrets he had never consciously revealed. His hands trembled as he reached toward one of the documents, pulling it closer to examine the precise details of ammunition supplies and defensive positions. I don't understand, sir," Brenner whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own racing heartbeat. "I never wrote any of this. I would never—" "Wouldn't you?" Morrison interrupted, his gray eyes studying Brenner with the intensity of a hawk observing its prey. "These pages were found in your quarters, Lieutenant. Every word documented during your conversations with the German prisoners over the past several months." The revelation hit Brenner like a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air as the implications crashed over him in waves. He remembered the casual conversations, the seemingly innocent exchanges about weather and food rations, the moments when he had felt comfortable enough to share stories from home. Each memory now twisted into something sinister, a betrayal he had committed without even realizing it. In another part of the camp, the sound of footsteps echoed through the laboratory corridor as Dr. Hoffman was escorted toward Morrison's office by two stern-faced guards. His mind raced with possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. The German scientist had spent months believing that his secrets remained locked safely within his own consciousness, protected by his iron will and professional discipline. When Hoffman entered the office, Morrison gestured toward a second chair that had been positioned beside Brenner's. The two men sat in stunned silence as Morrison continued his methodical display of evidence. Technical drawings emerged from manila folders, detailed schematics of chemical processes and weapons development that Hoffman had sworn he would never reveal to his captors. "These are your calculations, Dr. Hoffman," Morrison stated matter-of-factly, pointing to complex mathematical formulas written in Hoffman's distinctive Germanic script. "Formulas for chemical compounds that your government spent years developing. Formulas that you believed existed only in your memory." Hoffman's face drained of color as he stared at the papers, recognizing not only his handwriting but also the precise technical details that he had guarded so carefully. His hands shook as he traced the familiar equations with his fingertip, each symbol a testament to his unconscious betrayal of everything he had sworn to protect. The door opened again, and Sergeant Chen entered the room with quiet dignity. His presence seemed to fill the space with an unexpected authority, his dark eyes reflecting both intelligence and determination. Despite the yellow star sewn onto his uniform, a reminder of the suspicion that had followed Japanese Americans since Pearl Harbor, Chen carried himself with the confidence of a man who had proven his worth through dedication and skill. "Sergeant Chen has been instrumental in developing the chemical processes that made this operation possible," Morrison explained, his voice carrying a note of respect that surprised both prisoners. "While his own family remains in internment camps, questioned for their loyalty to America, he has worked tirelessly to serve his country and uncover the truth." Chen stepped forward, his movements precise and purposeful as he began explaining the science behind their psychological operation. His voice remained steady and professional as he described how specific chemical compounds had been incorporated into everyday items throughout the prison camp: the invisible ink in typewriter ribbons, the memory-enhancing substances in drinking water, the subliminal triggers embedded in seemingly innocent conversations. "The human mind is remarkably susceptible to suggestion when the right conditions are created," Chen explained, his eyes moving between the two shocked prisoners. "We simply provided the environment for your subconscious minds to reveal what your conscious mind sought to protect." Morrison reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a stack of letters, each one bearing the familiar heading of the International Red Cross. Brenner and Hoffman recognized them immediately as the correspondence they had been allowed to send to their families, letters they had believed were being transmitted blank due to faulty equipment. "Every letter you thought you were sending home empty actually contained detailed confessions and intelligence," Morrison revealed, spreading the correspondence across the desk like playing cards. "The invisible ink activated after you finished writing, revealing information that your conscious minds never intended to share." The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Hoffman felt his carefully constructed sense of dignity crumble as he realized that every moment of perceived American incompetence had been carefully orchestrated. The broken typewriters, the seemingly careless guards, the casual conversations, all had been part of an elaborate deception designed to exploit his own arrogance and preconceptions. Meanwhile, in the prisoners' barracks, Sergeant Miller sat on his narrow cot, staring at a letter that had just been returned to him by the camp administration. The paper felt heavy in his hands as he read his own words describing troop movements and defensive strategies, information he had shared in what he believed were harmless conversations about his military service. Tears streamed down his weathered face as he understood the terrible implications of his unconscious betrayal. "Mein Gott," he whispered to himself, his voice breaking with the weight of realization. "What have I done?" The sound of approaching footsteps made him look up to see other German prisoners receiving similar returned letters, their faces reflecting the same horror and disbelief. The carefully maintained solidarity of the prisoner community began to fracture as each man confronted the reality of his own unwitting collaboration with the enemy. Back in Morrison's office, the captain continued his methodical revelation of the operation's scope and success. Charts and graphs covered the walls, displaying the intelligence gathered from dozens of prisoners across multiple camps. The information had already begun influencing Allied strategy, providing crucial insights into German defensive positions, supply lines, and troop strengths. Similar programs are being implemented in prisoner camps across Allied territories, Morrison explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. We've learned to use the enemy's own assumptions against them, turning their arrogance into our greatest weapon. Dr. Hoffman raised his head slowly, his eyes meeting Morrison's with a mixture of defeat and grudging respect. The German scientist had spent his career believing in his own intellectual superiority, convinced that American researchers were inferior to their European counterparts. The revelation of his complete manipulation shattered not only his confidence, but his entire worldview. "You have taught us a valuable lesson, Captain," Hoffman said quietly, his accent thick with emotion. "One that we should have learned long ago." Lieutenant Brenner sat in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. The American intelligence operation had succeeded beyond all expectations, gathering information that would influence the war's outcome while leaving the prisoners feeling completely outmaneuvered by opponents they had consistently underestimated. As the meeting concluded and the prisoners were escorted back to their quarters, Morrison remained in his office, studying the evidence of their success. The winter morning had given way to a gray afternoon, but the satisfaction of their achievement warmed him more than any fire could have. He picked up one final document, a comprehensive report that would be forwarded to intelligence headquarters, detailing every aspect of the operation's methodology and results. The sound of footsteps in the corridor reminded him that the war continued, that other battles remained to be fought and won. But this victory, achieved through psychological warfare rather than bullets and bombs, represented something significant. Proof that intelligence and strategy could triumph over brute force and assumptions of superiority. In the months that followed, the reverberations of the operation would be felt throughout the intelligence community, establishing new protocols and methods that would shape psychological warfare for generations to come. The German prisoners, meanwhile, would carry the weight of their unconscious betrayal for the rest of their lives, a constant reminder of a lesson learned too late. As evening approached and the camp settled into its routine rhythms, the words that would define the operation's legacy echoed through the minds of all who had witnessed its revelation. "We should have remembered that the most dangerous enemy is the one you underestimate. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of innovation, disbelief, and the clash between old-world skepticism and modern technology. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke curiosity, and inspire appreciation for progress, creativity, and the power of human ingenuity."